Welcome, colleagues. This is the Responsible Global Academic Partnerships Training Workshop 1, Introduction. And it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you today. My name is Zamia Chasi, and I'm your facilitator for today. I would like to briefly welcome you and talk you through what we are going to do today, specifically touching on the workshop purpose, the program that we have for you, a couple of housekeeping rules, and give you a little bit of background about myself. So in terms of the purpose, you will have seen in the information that was shared with you at the beginning, or rather in preparation for this meeting, that this workshop is an introduction to the entire training program. You will know that we're offering 5 workshops in total. So this really today aims to provide you with a basic understanding of the context of this training program and its focus. And it will provide you with an opportunity to critically reflect on your own partnerships, practices, and experiences. So in terms of the key points of focus, you will know that we are looking at international partnerships. We are looking at partnerships between universities mostly. These partnerships have been established for education and research purposes. And in the context of the global networks, the focus, of course, is on Finnish universities and their partners in the global south. And you will know the 6 global networks that have been set up that work with institutions in Africa and in India and in China. And in terms of the key concepts and principles that we want to touch on today, we will be talking about issues of equity, reciprocity, responsibility, due diligence, and we'll also touch on ethics, responsiveness, and inclusion. In terms of the program, just to give you a brief overview, we will kick off our discussions today with a Mentimeter poll on the characteristics of responsible global academic partnerships. Then we'll have a plenary discussion where we particularly want to focus on issues of equality and equity and how they relate to each other. And then you will have considerable time to engage with each other in breakaway sessions, where we specifically want to look at the challenges in North-South partnerships and how we can tackle them. And then we'll all come back in a plenary session again, where we share feedback from these sessions. And of course, I'll give a summary of the main issues before I close the session. So this is just a brief overview of what you can expect. Before we continue, I think it's quite useful for me to give you a little bit of feedback on who I am and how I approach the topic in question. I am a facilitator, researcher, and scholar in international education. I've worked in this field for more than 20 years now, from my first job as an Erasmus outgoing mobility coordinator at my home university in Rostock in Germany. But I've lived and worked in South Africa for more than 20 years now. So I am bringing particularly Southern perspectives to you today. The focus of my work and research interests is international partnerships, specifically those between institutions in what we call the global North and the global South. And I am also at the moment particularly interested in exploring decolonial approaches to internationalization in general and partnerships in particular. So as I said, I'm bringing practitioner scholar perspectives to you. I will mostly represent global South perspectives today, using particularly the example of South Africa, the country where I am currently based. So as I said, let's kick off with the first activity. If you can click on that link, please, it'll take you to a Mentimeter poll. The window that you will see, I took a screenshot and I put it here on the slide. So it will say Mentimeter. And the question is, what are the characteristics of responsible global academic partnerships? If you had to describe them in a couple of words, don't write long stories, but perhaps you have some adjectives, you have some phrases that you think would describe what responsible global academic partnerships actually are, their main characteristics, etc. So please click on that link. Let us know if it works. Enter your responses. You can enter more than one, so you can type something, submit, and then you can submit another response. And I will go to a results page. So I will stop sharing my screen at the moment. Wonderful. Okay, then everybody, I invite you to read along with me. So here are some of the things that come up as characteristics of responsible global academic partnerships. You're seeing mutual trust, equality, mutual respect and trust, win-win benefits for global sustainability, reciprocity, shared vision, priorities and responsibilities, respecting each other's strengths, mutual and reciprocal, respect again, you'll see there is a lot of overlap here, mutual formulation of objectives, reciprocity, respect, openness, not knowing. I'm not sure if that means is perhaps linked to curiosity and openness to learn things. Sustainability, respect again, and trust, that's something that comes up a lot. Reciprocal partnerships, yes, honesty, equality, reciprocity is evident, peer model in practice, shared goal and impact desired. Yes, I think that's taking up a couple of the things that have been mentioned. You're also seeing personal connections, active listening, leveling hierarchies in ways of knowing, doing, and being, the will to learn, the will to deeply engage, and commitment. Yes, that's quite a number of things that are all important. Dialogue, I think that is directly linked to what you've just said about active listening, mutual respect, trust, frequent, maybe that means frequent interaction. In order to build these trust relationships, you have to engage with each other and have to do it regularly. Equal participation, equal financing, and respectful communication is another input. Shared goals, commitment to innovation, sharing knowledge, collaborative activities, yes. And here a number of things that raise the issue that there needs to be shared responsibility, shared understanding, and openness, like-mindedness, common interests, etc., to work towards a goal. Yes, wonderful. Transparent and open dialogue between partners, equal voices, yes, that's a new point. Fair, global responsible academic partnerships are fair and just, you say. There's equal opportunity to impact the plans and the implementation. That's quite an interesting point as well. Interest in learning from each other and from others, sharing knowledge and mutual benefit. Initiatives from the global south, question mark, exclamation mark. That's interesting. Yes, I think maybe that speaks to agency, global south agency and participation. You also say that in responsible global academic partnerships, we are considerate of our partners, we are open-minded, and we look at achieving 50-50 benefits. I think that speaks to the win-win situation that someone else mentioned earlier. Fair and honest cooperation. Yes, absolutely. Transparency based on mutual trust, openness, and inclusivity. Epistemological injustice. Well, I hope what you mean is that it is that these partnerships can address epistemological injustice and work towards epistemological justice as a characteristic of global academic partnerships, or perhaps that's a characteristic of something that we want to achieve and where we are not quite yet. Respect and understanding, transfer of knowledge. Hopefully that will go both ways. Okay, if you can please, yes, if you can keep your microphones off if you're not speaking to the group, thank you. Whitening of higher education, colonial influence in higher education. I interpret that as being very much linked. I would like to ask the person who put that comment on whitening of higher education, if you can explain to us what that means or what you mean. If you do it here, then it will be anonymous. If you do it in the chat, then we can see where that comes from. Collaboration initiatives, partnership initiatives, sustainable partnerships, and then there is a new element here, integration. Yes, I hope that we have, this is quite a lot. As you can see, I think what we will do is we can copy these responses and make them available to you when we also share the presentation of today. So you can look at this. I hope I did not leave anything out that was particularly important. I think what is quite interesting here is that we see a lot of overlap. There's a big focus, perhaps not surprisingly, because we already also mentioned some of these terms, on equality and equity, on reciprocity, on mutuality, and respect, openness, tolerance, inclusiveness, etc., etc. Well, okay, then I think there's no more entries that are being made at the moment. Then I am going to move to the next one. This was the results page that we had seen, where I had shared with you. So I think some of the things, perhaps just for me, unless there is someone, I don't see any hands, so I don't see that anybody wants to add to that at this point in time. What would be quite interesting for you to consider yourself, now that you know what your own responses were, you saw what the other responses were, and it is perhaps useful to think about, to reflect for a moment. Is there alignment? Were there things that you had not thought about? Were there things that you surprised you? And how do you relate to all of the input that has been given? And as I said, this is something that you can do today and reflect on now for a little bit. You can also, once we share the presentation and we share the results with you, this is perhaps also a conversation that is worth having with your colleagues at some point. So as the next activity, what I would like you to do is to look at the picture on the screen, or the two images on the screen that are titled Equality and Equity. And can I please invite someone? I hope that there is one person at least who is perhaps even familiar with these, has seen them before, and would not mind giving us an interpretation of what this means. What is it that is depicted here in these pictures? What do these pictures illustrate? Oh yes, there is a hand. Ken, let us hear what you think these images represent.
Well, thank you so much, and good afternoon. So the picture on the left, equality. So equality, from my own understanding, means the sameness. So the state of being same. But on the right, equity is more about affirmative action. So trying to sort of give an advantage to people who are historically disadvantaged. So trying to make them level up and be on the same level as the rest. So that's my understanding of equality and equity. Equity is more about affirmative action, like trying to help people who are kind of not in the same level as others to rise up and level up. While equality is just trying to give everybody same opportunity, like making everybody be same.
Okay. Yeah. Yes, thank you very much. I hope that everybody, let me take one step back. I hope that everybody understands and sees what these pictures are. It's about three people trying to watch a match looking over a fence, right? And on the equality side, all three people have been given the same kind of boxes. And on the equity side, the boxes have been arranged differently, responding to the needs of the individuals that we see depicted here. And mostly the difference, of course, here is one of height. Absolutely. Thank you so much for that first contribution, Ken, much appreciated. I see currently two more hands on my side. Sushetana, is that pronounced correctly? Can I ask you to put your camera on and also give us your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you so much. Unfortunately, my camera cannot be switched on. If that is okay, I'd like.
Of course, no worries. Please speak. We can hear you well.
So I think I totally agree with Ken. And in addition, when I see this picture, I also think of how our strengths are distributed differently. So in this particular case, we are talking about height, but if this was a different situation, for example, weight or smartness or running capability or something, it would have been different. So I think not only that equity should be focusing on the weaknesses or the lack of what there is not, but also thinking in a broader sense that which kind of strength can we then build up and use, and how others can help like share that and use that for their to kind of complement their lack of that particular strength. And this is ultimately bringing us all to the same ground and equity. So maybe my explanation is not directly about this diagram, not directly about these pictures, but this is how I personally feel, that if we only consider about what is lacking, it is not fair, because we are all having strengths of different kinds. We all have something to contribute, to give. So this is something I wanted to highlight.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I think it's very much related to the image that we see here. You are extending the conversation and you're going into the partnership space. And I think we will come back to the points that you made a little bit later in the workshop, but thank you very much. I think it's a very important point that you have raised here. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
I see two more hands and I'm just going, please accept my apology if I'm not going by the order in which they were raised. I'm literally looking at my screen and I see who is coming up next. So Sai, can I ask you please to come and share your thoughts? And if you can, please do switch your camera on.
So my thinking about these pictures may be related to my my experience in education, and in particular inclusive education. And I see these concepts a little bit from a different perspective. I think equality is a kind of like an end result, a goal. We want to provide equal position to people, equal opportunities. But in order to achieve that equal position or equal opportunities, we need equity, because we know that we are different, we have different needs, and we have a different, let's say, starting points. So we need support. We need, some people need some more to achieve the same position where they can, let's say, achieve the equal position. So that's how I perceive it.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I think that is another very interesting perspective that really also tells us that a lot of times when we talk about equality and equity, we're not talking about a static picture. We're talking about a dynamic process. We are talking about the fact that we are somewhere and that we want to go somewhere. And maybe that somewhere where we want to go is different. So thank you so much for sharing that. I really like that. So equality more as the kind of end result, as you said, and equity, what we need to apply in order to get to that point where everybody has equal opportunity. Very interesting. Thank you for sharing your perspective, Sai. And I see one more hand and we still have some time, so I'm happy to take it. Dr. Rahul Mohanani, is that right? Rahul, please.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Share your thoughts.
My apologies, I cannot switch on the camera, unfortunately.
No problem.
So I see this picture in terms of, so in addition to whatever has been told till now, I see this picture in terms of the goal, the end goal. So here I believe that the end goal is for the three children, I would say, is to watch the match. Now, there is some way that each of them can't. And then there is some body who is giving them some sort of resources based on their need. Now, in the first picture, in equality, they are being given the resources equally. So each, which doesn't work. And in the second block, they are giving the resources based on their circumstances, based on the situation they are in. So equality would mean, according to me, is giving equally the same resources to any person, to any group, irrespective of what kind of circumstances they are in. Whereas equity, giving those or some sort of resources based on the situation the person or the body finds them in. So that's kind of my interpretation of this.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for sharing that. I think we're all This is quite interesting for me to see that, we seem to be sharing the same understanding. We also seem to be using the same language to try and interpret what we see here. Just perhaps as an add-on, I think it was Sai who mentioned this, that you looked at this from an education perspective. This image itself is often used in equality, diversity, and inclusion training, actually, as one to explain the difference between equality and equity. And in that sense, equality, also like you said just now, Rahul, is often equated with sameness. So if we look at that picture, everybody gets the same support, regardless of what their individual circumstances are and what their needs are. Whereas equity, on the other hand, is often also used as a synonym for fairness in a way. So it is differentiated support that takes an individual's needs and circumstances. And here in this case, as we said, it's the height of the people in the picture into account. Absolutely. Thank you so much to everyone for coming forward to share your thoughts. And I see here, perhaps just in terms of a summary, that, we often have terms that are buzzwords or keywords that, you'll find in a lot of documents, you'll find in a lot of talks, you find in a lot of engagements. And sometimes it's quite useful to actually step back for a moment, pause and reflect and understand what is it that we actually mean when we use these terms, because it's quite easy to throw them around, if I can use that word so informally, and put them into your statements and your policies and strategies and ways in which you describe your partnerships to say, this is something that we are striving for. But particularly in a partnership, it's quite useful to have an engagement with your partners and with your colleagues to ask, how do you understand this term? Do we actually share our understanding and our views? And do they differ? And if they do, how might that impact our work? And how do we come to these shared visions, values, etc., that some of you highlighted as important characteristics of responsible global academic partnerships? So thank you very much. I don't see any other hand at this point. So what I will do is I will move us along. What I would like to do is now, with all of this background that we have had in terms of the discussion and the exchange that we have just had on these terms, equality and equity. Now, in partnerships, we often talk about equitable partnerships practices that take this fairness concern, that differentiation concern into account. Can we just spend a moment to think about what does this mean in the partnership space specifically? So we've looked at the kind of like the abstract understanding of these terms. Now let's look at partnerships that we have, partnerships that we perhaps manage, that we are engaged in, etc. What does this mean? I want to give you an example of what I call imbalanced student exchanges. I don't know if this is something that relates to you, if you have been involved in student exchange partnerships. And in South Africa, and as I said at the beginning, I am drawing a lot of my experience in working in the South African context with partners all over the world, but of course today specifically with partners in the global north. And there, we often receive partnerships requests to establish student exchange programs. And often these programs are based on exchanging two students a semester, a study abroad semester, tuition fees are waived, etc., etc. Credits are awarded and acknowledged at each of the institutions, etc. Now, from a South African perspective and from a global South perspective, these kind of arrangements hardly ever work. Normally, South African universities have no difficulty in receiving students, but they can't send out anyone. And there are a number of reasons as to why that is: financial constraints, different academic years, different credit transfer systems, etc., only one of them. And so we often had to enter into a negotiation with our partner universities to say, how can we make these exchanges work? And how can we create benefit for everybody involved, all the institutions involved? And so this is an example that I would like to share. We sometimes ended up with an agreement where the South African university was happy to receive these two undergraduate students for a study abroad semester. where the tuition fee was waived, etc. But in return, instead of sending 2 undergraduate students for a semester, maybe the South African institution only sent 1 student, a postgraduate student, who stayed for a shorter period of time, perhaps 3 months or so, to make use of the facilities, laboratories, and libraries, etc., at the host institution, perhaps to be supervised or mentored, and to, of course, start networking, etc., etc. And this person went for a shorter period of time and did not receive a tuition waiver, but a stipend to supplement subsistence and living costs. So this is an example of my practice of how student exchange can happen, but it is imbalanced. So it's not an eye for an eye. It's not 2 undergraduate students each way. Institutions came together to find a way in which an exchange program can work for both partners. And why is it that something like this works? Traditionally, in the global north, institutions, as part of their internationalization agendas, look for study abroad places for their undergraduate students. Traditionally, in the global south, students and their teachers and professors are not so interested actually in sending students out at the undergraduate level, but are very much looking for opportunities for international exposure for their postgraduate students. And sometimes these postgraduate students are staff members of the institutions, and so this becomes also a career development opportunity. This is an example that I thought I'll share with you. And of course, I invite you to think about other examples of equitable partnerships practices that you might be able to share with us. I'll give you a moment to think about it. If somebody would like to come forward and share an example, or even just share your thoughts and opinions about the example that I have given, then please do that. Let's take a moment to see if when we translate our equality and equity conversation into the direct partnerships practice space, is there something that you can share that would be an example of how a partnerships practice is equitable, and where perhaps you had to come up with a negotiated agreement with your partners to really make sure there is reciprocity and there is mutual benefit? Let's hear from Katarina.
Yeah, hello, everybody.
Hello.
I was just thinking of kind of a situation where you are kind of pushed into a funding framework, which in itself perhaps is not exactly promoting equality in terms of, I know this kind of situation where we have Finnish funding for exchange between Finland and a country in a university in the south, and then you might have several universities in south who would also like to do exchanges between themselves. Mm-hmm. But because of the framework of the funding instrument, this becomes problematic. So it's a kind of structural problem in the funding system, just as an example.
Yeah. No, thank you very much for sharing that, Katarina. I think this is something that everybody can relate to, because of course, partnerships take money in order to be able to exchange students and staff members and do joint research, etc., etc. We always do need funding, and very often this funding comes from external organizations and funding organizations and bodies. I think we touched on some of these issues also in the UniPID seminar that was hosted in December last year, and actually highlighted the importance of organizations such as UniPID to be the link between institutions who are involved in these partnerships and are implementing them, and funding organizations, which is often, for example, government departments, etc., to really explain what the criteria are that are conducive, or what the environment is that would be conducive to partnerships. And often funding mechanisms come with many strings attached. And is something, poses another challenge for partners to make sure that even within a relatively rigid framework, you can still find ways in which you can achieve benefit to everybody. Very often I have found that when the moment you put it on the table and you acknowledge that these are some of the constraints and you invite everybody to find solutions, very often these solutions are possible. And you know, I think that's one element of it. And the other is that I think it's really also our responsibility in terms of people who have partnerships experience to report this back to funding organizations and to seek that dialogue with them to see what kind of changes are possible in the instruments and mechanisms that they design. So I think this is an important element that speaks to that agency component that someone touched on earlier, not only on behalf of the Global South, of course, but also the partners in the Global North, to see how can we influence policy making in that sense, strategy setting, etc., etc. Okay, colleagues, well, thank you so much. It's wonderful that you are so engaged and you participate in these discussions. Let's continue in that way. And I think we're going to leave it here for now in terms of our conversation and exchange on topics of equality and equity, which are so important when it comes to global academic and responsible partnerships, as the key focus of this particular training program and today's workshop. So what I would like to do now is I would like to introduce the next session, which will be our breakaway sessions. So we have currently, I can see 51 participants in this meeting. It's a little less than people who had registered, but I think that's okay. We understood, we got some last minute apologies. So we are going to work with the group that we have, and we are still going to break away into 3 different groups. We'll talk a little bit about the logistics in a moment. But first, what I would like to do is just to set it up for you. So what we would like to focus on now in our breakaway sessions are some of these challenges in North-South partnerships and how we can overcome them. So just reflecting on the challenges is one thing, but of course we are here to learn from each other. So it's also important to say, if we have experienced these, what were we able to do about it? And what can we all learn from these examples? We will divide the conversation into 3 groups. And the first group will focus on research collaborations, the second on partnership administration and management, and the third on field work. And you will see that these 3 groups actually align with workshops that are coming later in the series, where we specifically want to zoom in on these aspects of partnership work, research, administration, management, and field work. So today we are going to set the scene for that. In terms of general background, I would like to share something with you in order to kind of like get the thinking going. I would like to share something with you, an extract from the tender document that UniPID published when they published the call for tenders for proposals for this training workshop. And I would like to read that because I think it really sets the scene quite nicely. So it said in this document, in principle, the global academic collaborations are expected to be based on equal, reciprocal, and responsible partnerships. However, despite the good intentions, North-South collaboration discourses and practices still often turn out to be fairly Eurocentric. This is related to issues such as how we understand and consider the complex global and local contexts and power relations in academic collaborations, how we engage our partners, and how we talk about and with our partners in the Global South. So I know this is quite a handful to take in, but I think it also speaks and takes up a lot of the characteristics and elements that you highlighted in response to the first question that we did using the Mentimeter poll about challenges in North-South partnerships, and that they do exist, that they are often aligned to imbalances that often have something to do with funding, but also with power relations in these partnerships, and that there is a dominant aspect when it comes to the northern partners, and we will explore that a little bit more. in terms of Eurocentric views, perspectives, theories, knowledge, etc., etc. So this is something that I wanted to share with you from the tender document, also kind of like explains the background of why we are here today and what it is that we are actually trying to achieve. So in terms of the logistics, what I would like you to do, we will, of course, assign these breakaway sessions. My colleague Eva will be moving you into the different breakaway groups. One group will actually stay here in the main room, if we can call it that, and 2 groups will be going into breakaway sessions. What I would like you to do is in each session where you find yourself, we will not moderate these. So one of us will be there, one of the facilitators will be in the room with you, but really ideally as a silent observer. So we would like you to take initiative to manage the session yourself. So please, if one person can volunteer or can be nominated as a spokesperson, the main responsibility that you will have is to listen very carefully to the discussion, to note perhaps some things down on a piece of paper or using your laptop. And of course, then when we come back into the feedback session, to report back to the group. So that will be a very important responsibility that you take on. I will be sharing 3 scenarios with you that are presented as quotations from my PhD research on North-South higher education partnerships. I've chosen them to illustrate some of the challenges that are aligned to the 3 areas that I just touched on in terms of the areas of focus for this discussion. And I would like you as a group then to engage with the following questions. First of all, just reflect on this quotation and the scenario that it represents, and think for a moment whether that actually resonates with you. Think about if it resonates, how and why, and if it doesn't, perhaps also you want to say why that's not the case. Then as a second step, please reflect on whether you have had experience with the same challenge as is illustrated here or something similar. So this is the second step. First of all, you think about, how does this relate to you? Does it ring any bells? Does it resonate? Does it bring back memories? Is it a problem that you are currently facing, etc.? And then you kind of like really try to engage in what are these challenges that you have experienced. And thirdly, and importantly, not only reflect on the challenge that you've had, but also on what you were able to do to overcome it, or if in fact you were able to overcome it. So just also share that with the group. And then we will call you back. We will have about 30 minutes for this exercise. So hopefully that's sufficient time. In our groups, we will have less than 20 people in each group. So hopefully everybody will get a chance to speak. And we will come back into the plenary to report back. But before we go, I will talk you through each of the scenarios so that you not only know what you will be discussing in your own group, but also what are the discussions in the other groups. So as I said, I have chosen these quotations from interviews that I conducted as part of my PhD research on North-South partnerships and higher education, where I used a South African university as a case study to explore their relationships, their partnerships, and specifically the challenges that they experienced in their relations with institutions in the global North. So the quotations are all participants that were based at that institution, both academic staff and support staff that shared their experiences with North-South partnerships. The first one is a quote that reflects on research collaboration. I will just read it out for you. And at the end of the session, when we've discussed all 3 scenarios, I'll give you an opportunity to ask questions if something is not clear. But for now, let me read this quote out for you. This participant said the following things. And one of the things that's very central to our North-South collaborations is that, the way in which film is taught in a very conventional way. And that conventional way of teaching, it has been predicated on the fact that film has to look a certain way. And of course, the reason why it's easy to sit on the couch on a Saturday night and watch a Hollywood film is because that film language has become so conventionalized that you understand how to read it. And even though, particularly in this quote, there is mentioning of teaching film, it was actually part of a broader conversation of what it means to also conduct research and to involve postgraduate students in joint research projects on film with partner institutions. So this is scenario 1. Scenario 2, and my quotation number 2, looks at partnership administration and management specifically. And here it says, the person said the following. And when it comes to the American institutions, and sometimes British and European, when they really do not want to let go of a clause, more often than not, we'll capitulate because we really want the partnership. So this, as you can imagine, is from somebody who works in the legal office and is involved in contract negotiation and finalization of agreements, partnership agreements. So this is our second scenario. And the third one is this. And this is an illustration of fieldwork practice. I said to him, I was deeply, deeply upset to see all those publications and you didn't acknowledge. It's not even that we demanded anything more than one sentence that said, we acknowledge that this work was done in the laboratory in the microbiology department at the University of the Witwatersrand. So this here is an example of a partner institution coming to do field work at the South African University, then publishing about that field work without even acknowledging where the data was collected. And this is an example of challenges that relate to field work, but of course, you can also put that into the context of research in terms of the publications that emerge from field work. So having read all of these scenarios out loud, I want to just remind you of the questions. When you find yourself in your breakaway rooms, reflect on these questions. Do these scenarios resonate with you? Why or why not? Have you experienced this particular challenge that is illustrated here or something similar? And what have you been able to do to address these challenges or to overcome these challenges? So I will be in the fieldwork group, Rosanna will be in the project management group, and Eva will stay here in the main room with the research group. Eva, you will assign us now, but just before we do that, let's just see if there are any hands. I don't see any. I also don't see anything in the chat. So I hope that these scenarios were self-explanatory. And so what I would propose is that we take a good 30 minutes for you to, in your groups, reflect on these, address the questions as posed, and then we come back in about 30 minutes. Then enjoy the discussions in your smaller groups, and we'll see you shortly. Okay, well, welcome back, everybody. I was in group 3 and we had quite lively discussions. I hope that's the same for everybody. We realized, of course, that 30 minutes is not a lot of time for everyone to speak and for everyone to share, but hopefully at least you were able to, have some sort of an exchange that you can continue at a later point with your colleagues, with your partners, etc., etc. So let's now spend some time reflecting and sharing the feedback from the sessions. And I think we'll do that in order. We start with group 1. Who was appointed as the spokesperson for group 1? Okay, please go ahead. I see your hand is raised. Yes, the floor is yours. You're giving us feedback for group 1 and you looked into the research collaboration.
Yes.
Perfect, go ahead.
So as we discussed that not everyone had particularly research experiences, but different kinds of experience, the idea was kind of reflecting the same, that many had resonated that there is a cultural issue coming up, like quotation came up, that there is a standard way of thinking, there is a standard view of doing things, but is it the same for everyone? So we many speakers came up with the thought that yes, there are actually alternative views, and this standard and what is good might not be the same for everyone. So what we are doing, and someone pointed also out that we tend to do the way we are doing all the time, whichever we are, whether we are in Finland, we are in South Africa, we tend to follow our own way of doing it without realizing that the other side might have a totally different way of doing it. So first, as a resonation, I would say that everyone had this kind of feeling that, well, there is this difficulty, but also that they had felt that acknowledging this kind of alternative views is important. Also that power, that someone said that the history of colonialism and etc. might also affect the way we think as a culture, as a society, and that might also create a power relationship or imbalance between that. And another important point came up is the difference in resources. And this somehow is kind of equality situation, that we sometimes do not understand that what is their situation and whether they are capable what we are expecting them to deliver. So they may not feel confident, or they may not be able to say that out loud, but they feel that there might be more expectation than they can deliver. So this is something also came up when Sai said about one particular example. But another thing was that language. So language differences is very, very important point, that with Dennis's example, that they could not use the word conflict, because apparently conflict in Kiswahili means something that is far more serious and is used in relation to army conflict or fighting, and they wanted to use it as environmental conflict and conflict resolution. So that was also something that they had to then respect, that this sort of difference in understanding of the same word in a different way because of the cultural difference. So then they had to change that. And then it also came up that when should the partners be contacted when there is a funding and we want to do a joint program, joint research or whatever? When should the partners be contacted? Mary suggested that many a times she has seen with her already existing work pressure, and sometimes the funding calls have come up, but there was a difficulty in getting the partners on board, and then it came up that maybe it's wise or to be courageous enough to say that we do not continue with this funding and we try the next time, so that we are better prepared and more organized and know what each one of us as partners want from this funding. Mm-hmm. So kind of do that. And then there was some expression, there was some bad failures, so to say failures. In collaboration was also some experiences shared, and she said that she felt pressured of writing all the whole application and did not get adequate help from the partnering university outside Finland, and they had completely different expectations. They wanted results even before the application was gotten, so the funding was approved. So there was a very different level of expectation, because that was kind of maybe considered conventional in their country, that when we are putting the effort, there is a guarantee that the results will be high impact. So there, this kind of different ways of challenges have been faced, and how to address Well, it came up that we have to decide when to contact the partner and in good time. And secondly, that definition of what sort of themes and topics, what we want, that can be clarified from the very beginning. And my personal view also is that we need to have very clear communication, and somehow we need to respect each other so that no one feels that they are kind of made inferior or down, so that we all are in the same page. That is very important through communication and respect. So this is what we mostly discussed. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I can see that you also already discussed quite widely. You didn't actually only focus on the research component of it, but I think a lot of what you have said will resonate with the second group, which looked at project management and implementation, because there was a lot of practical learning in what you have said about communication, about funding, etc., etc. So I think we move straight on to group 2. And then we'll have some time at the end when we've heard the feedback from all different groups. We will have some time to kind of like summarize and come together in our final discussion. So can I ask the spokesperson for the second group that looked at partnership administration and management specifically, but maybe you also looked at it much broader, please share feedback with us.
Okay, this is Kavita, who is the spokesperson for the breakout session 2, Partnership Administration and Management.
Okay.
I understand from Sucheta that she has spoken more about partnership administration and management as well, but let me put across the points which we have discussed and what our spokesperson have mentioned about it. So our speakers have mentioned that there are initially, when the agreements are made, they initially agree to it, but they come back later when it comes to the implementation. There are some challenges, and they come back and they try to find out a solution for that. And also, they have mentioned that there is a power play changes based on the discussion or based on the laws of every region. And some examples were quoted, like the cases in Singapore or a case study of India. When it comes to the intellectual rights or any conflict, they would prefer the neutral court rather than being it in the region where the partner is located. So that's one thing which was mentioned. And there are also agreements which are which we make with organizations either in America or British. The clauses are very rigid, and it is like they have to accept for obvious reasons. There is no equity in that way. I mean, that's one point which was mentioned by one of our spokesperson. And strategic partnership, yeah, strategic partnership have more room for specific negotiation, not with the organization kind of agreements. And there are also different challenges when it comes to knowledge, like they always probably the global south feels that they are dominated by the global north. So how to overcome is also a discussion which, I mean, we have to look into it. Then there is a difference in structure based on the region. The education institutions are situated, the power and the legal, whether they have legal offices, and also sometimes they may not have even the international offices to handle such things. And as earlier it was mentioned, languages also are a problem. Like some agreements are made in the native languages, which there may not be a better understanding when it comes to conflict resolution and so on. Then there are issues like financial and human resources. So which has to be addressed while making the agreements. These are the few points which were mentioned. And if anyone would like to add to it, if I have missed something from my team.
Thank you so much. Thanks for providing also comprehensive feedback of the discussions in your group. Thank you so much. I think without much further ado, I'm going to hand right over to group 3. And I know who that is because that's the group that I was in. Deepa, can I ask you to put your camera on and speak to us and share with us what some of the discussions were that happened in group 3 that looked at the fieldwork component?
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Samia. So our group discussed, I think primarily the first portion of our discussion was, what do we mean by fieldwork? Is it research versus fieldwork versus what we call collaborative activity? And I think overall then we reached a kind of broad understanding that over here, when we talk about field work, we're talking about it from the terms of what we think, what Dr. Samia mentioned was the critique of the North-South. And in that people come from the North to the South, they collect the data, and the actual knowledge and in terms of the writing and so on happens back home. So there's very little interaction or activity that happens in partnership with where they got the data from. And then we went on to kind of discuss whether this does resonate with anyone. And Francisco has some experience in Brazil, and he agreed that this is in fact the case where data is collected and analysis does not happen there. It doesn't happen in the South. It's interpreted in the North. And then the next question that arose was, do we work together to interpret, and what does it mean for the body of knowledge that exists? And Kinnari came in here with an interesting kind of solution which they have at her university, where they have academics and other fieldwork partnerships, and they do acknowledge that this is a problem, which is why they have certain agreements and they have guidelines in place which have helped them to some extent. And overall, it would be good, it's felt, that we have these in place well in advance. And Cloneria came in and said, I think very emphatically, and I agree with her, that so thank you to the community really, really matters. And it helps people to understand where the data comes from. It gives them a perspective, a good context, and not only that, it benefits future researchers from the community too. So it's not only about taking, it's about giving back and respecting the community from which you took from. Then, of course, I mean, that led us to the next question, that is, are we giving communities an opportunity to engage? So once we get this data, what do we do with it? How do we return this information back to the community in a meaningful way, in hopefully a way that's not full of scientific jargon, in a way that they can understand? So do we report back to them with findings? And I like this term, avoiding the hit and run science method. So this is another item that we can think about. Then I think we moved on to the next point, which is in situations where people have tried to engage, they've tried to do joint field work and procedures, but protocols make it difficult. So I think what we need to think about is, how do we make this work in a way that benefits everybody, is easy to get off the ground, is not overly difficult or challenging. And again, coming back to other issues, Eva pointed out that there's, of course, issues of ownership, IP, whose knowledge is it anyway, and in whose name do we speak when we publish this data. And then we closed with saying that, yes, guidelines are good. They do need to be translated to a particular context. And at this point, I'd invite the other members of my team, maybe if they have something to add that I've missed, please come in here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you for sharing what I think were really rich discussions. In this short period of time, you were able to put your finger on so many issues that I think really illustrate also the complexities that we're, of these partnerships and some of the challenges that we are actually dealing with here. We have about 15 minutes left until the end of this workshop. So I would like to open up the floor now to everybody to come in and either supplement what your spokespersons reported back to, or add to that, or perhaps share an illustration or an example, or raise additional questions now that you've heard the discussion of all three. I think what is quite clear that we obviously, put you away into groups, and we created these artificial boundaries between research and project management and field work. But I think from your responses, we see that, of course, all of these are intertwined and overlap. And what you do in one area will have a consequence and an impact on something else. So we can't really look at them in isolation. We just try to, focus the discussion on a particular element of partnerships. And like we said, to open up also the thinking already in preparation for the more specific workshops that are going to follow. So at this point, are there any hands? Here is Victor to the question of when to start the collaboration, the sooner the better. Yes, absolutely. This is actually quite an important point that I think also came up in some of the discussion, to say, and in fact, also in some of the responses that you shared when you signed up for this workshop, because of course, there were a couple of questions that we asked you. And, to say that often this kind of partnership search starts when you already have a project designed and you are looking for an implementation partner. But in the sense of equal and equitable partnerships and mutually beneficial partnerships, it's actually important to get your partner in right from the start, in the conceptual phase and in the design phase of a project, and not only when it comes to implementation. I see there is a hand up. Alto, Kit, I don't know. Yes.
Which is the name? Okay, I'm Kit, and Alto is the university.
Oh, Alto University. Kit, yeah. Please come.
Thanks, Dr. Samia. It was really an interesting session to interact with all the colleagues with the different perspectives. I think when it comes to partnerships, if each of the partners see the equity, they will be willing to compromise. And based on the first thing to develop partnership is to really understand the partner, and also to understand the position or the difficulties, the challenges a partner might have. We should not only look at the benefits of a partnership or the strengths of a partner, but we should also look at the challenges and the situation of the partner as well. So if we are interested in a partner and if we think the partner is valuable for us, and the partnership will be built from day one based on very open negotiations, and not even negotiations, but discussions and discussions. Discussions after discussions really lead the way to a partnerships, because you open up during discussions and you find your way. So I really don't think there is kind of any structured way of developing a partnership, but every partnership so differently developed and evolved. Every partnership evolved rather than being developed by itself. So if you value a partner, you will find your way. And if you put equity as the primary goal, then you will act based on that. I think I can also speak for the Finnish institutions here. I think when it comes to equity or treating the partner with respect, I would really, really appreciate the Finnish institutions that they are doing their best. I haven't come across a single institution in my perspective that really wants to really extract something out of a partner. It always wants to play with the partner in an equal and open manner. So I think I'm very proud of it from the global, not mostly, especially the Finnish point of view. In that way.
Okay.
And revenue generation is not even a priority for any Finnish institution. That's just my perspective of what I see from Alto.
Yeah. Thank you. And thank you for sharing your perspectives. I think it is important, as you mentioned, to share your perspectives and to engage in dialogue with colleagues, and to also be willing to have your own experience and your own practice and your own views challenged, and put them out there for scrutiny. The other thing that you mentioned, which I think is really important and is kind of like almost like a red thread to all of the conversations that we've had, is that element of due diligence. You know, in order to really find a partnership that works for everybody involved, even though this might be differently in terms of different outputs, different benefits, is something that really takes time and takes willingness and commitment to actually explore that. You mentioned, you know, the willingness to compromise, for example, but that is based also on needing to understand what actually are the contexts that we are dealing with. And in that sense, I think one of the other things that has come through quite strongly is that ability to critically self-reflect. And to really step back, pause, look at your own assumptions. Because as you said, Kit, no one goes out into partnerships, I think, willingly to do harm. But sometimes harm still happens, and it happens in ways that we are not necessarily, you know, that we don't know or that we are not aware of. So I think this invitation of dialogue, of conversation, of exploring, when we say this, do we mean the same things? You know, like that element of definitions that we were talking about earlier, to say what is it, you know, where are we all starting from? How are we coming into this partnership? What are we trying to achieve together? How can we learn from each other, et cetera, et cetera. And I think ethics is, of course, another thing. Ethical behavior, ethical conduct, integrity are some of the things. Transparency, honesty, I think, were some of the elements that came up in different conversations that are of key importance. Johanna mentioned in our group, in group 3, that there, of course, also often guidelines and protocols that are actually in place in that regard, and that it is, you know, expected of researchers who conduct these kind of projects that they behave in a particular way. And we kind of like discussed that sometimes it might be necessary to really reflect on these very practically and see, what do these general broad guidelines mean for my specific project, for my specific partnership, and for my day-to-day partnerships work. Okay, is there anybody else who would like to add or share in addition to what we've already heard? I don't see any hands up at the moment. I also don't see any more notes in the chat. Then I think what I will do is I will round us off. I think a lot of the points that I wanted to highlight, I've already now spoken on in response to some of your input. Perhaps also really just to say, I think that came through very clearly that these North-South partnerships are challenging. A lot of the challenges that you have highlighted are along the lines of resources and what is available to people. And you looked at it really in different ways in terms of human capacity, in terms of infrastructure and institutions, in terms of institutional support. You know, you mentioned legal offices, international offices, and all of that. These things are important. Of course, when it comes to funding, we know that there is a short link between resources and power, and often the dynamic that plays out in partnerships is that whoever brings the money can dictate the terms. Even though, Kit, you now reflected that this is perhaps something that you don't see happening in the Finnish context, and in the attitudes generally that Finnish institutions bring into their partnerships work. And this is also something to reflect on, because, you know, we spoke a lot about culture, and culture, of course, comes at the level of individuals that are involved in partnerships, institutions that are involved in partnerships, and then, of course, also countries to some extent, if we talk about national attitudes and national expectations and national positions on a particular subject. And so this is, of course, also something that I think is really important to take on board and to take into consideration. So one of the things that we would like you to do, and Eva, please tell me if you can share the link to the feedback forms.
Done it, Samia.
Sorry?
It's on the chat now.
Is it already on the chat? Oh, perfect. Oh, yes, I can see it there. Okay, so please have a look at the chat. Sometimes it's good to do it right away. Click on the link, fill in the feedback form, please. As you know, this was the beginning of a whole series of workshops that are happening as part of this training program. And it's really important for us that you share your feedback with us. We are going to do this for each individual workshop, and then also, of course, also have a feedback on the training course in its entirety. Some of you are attending all the workshops or many of them, so we will do that. And then before I close, let me just say that the next workshop in the series is the one on power dynamics and partnerships, where we will look a little bit in more detail and go deeper into some of the issues that actually already came up today. And I think all three of the breakaway groups, there were issues of power dynamics that emerged. So next week, we are going to look at that in more detail. We are going to also look at some of the decolonial approaches to partnerships. So that's next week on the 11th of May at the same time. So it's 1 to 3 for you, 12 to 2 for me. And of course, we look forward to seeing as many of you as possible. There's a question in the chat as to whether there is going to be a calendar invite. And yes, Eva is going to send out to all the people that registered the joining instructions and some information in advance. So all that is left at this point for me is to say thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking up this offer of engaging with us, and you were really wonderfully active and shared very generously and willingly your own experiences, your own points of view, your own perspectives. And I think there is really good learning in all of that for us. And so with that, I would like to thank you so much. I hope that many of you will be with us again in the following weeks, and that we can continue this conversation, which is very important if we want to bring about changes and positive changes in this traditional partnerships paradigm that is perhaps challenging or sometimes problematic, and really move towards more equitable, more inclusive engagements that benefit both partners in the North and in the South. And with that, I thank you very much. There is an email address here for UniPID on the last slide if you want any more information about this particular workshop or about the training program. And yeah, I am going to close us off now. Enjoy the rest of the day, and hopefully we'll see you soon. Thank you.